Speaking in a certain language for an extended period of time, it affects your identity. You are gaining worlds of additional people that you are able to communicate with. The feeling I get when you're going through a word and you discover that we took it from another language, which they took it from another language for this reason or the other, with every one of these, there is a story and there's a treasure, and it just makes me so happy. Like, I can't describe it. I know it sounds trite to say it or cliche, but it does feel like the most universal language.
Are you a singer? Do you enjoy actually singing as well?
Oh, hell no.
This is the Language Podcast, and I'm Richard Simcott. On the show today, we have Fadi BouKaram, Lebanese-born photographer and language lover. In this series, we're giving you the tools you need to start learning a language. And this is a really special episode for me because during the pandemic, I was one of those people that hit TikTok, looking for my tribe, my fellow language lovers. And I came across Fadi, who makes videos on language and culture, telling stories of language and how it's impacted and enriched his life. So as we come to the end of this series of the Language Podcast, I thought he'd be the perfect person to speak to in order to reflect on the lessons we've learned throughout. First of all, let's start from your story, because people listening to you now who don't know your background and don't know who you are, where you've come from or anything, are probably listening to this and thinking, have you asked this American guy to come on the podcast? Tell us about that. I mean, which languages did you start off in life speaking, and how are we talking now with this American sounding voice?
That's a tough one. The American voice, I'm not 100% sure where it came from, but the idea is I'm Lebanese, full-on Lebanese from Lebanon, born and raised. I did not leave the country for the first time until I was in my early 20s. So as far as language acquisition, of course, I had to learn English in school because our school system back home is trilingual. But the idea is that you always had a main foreign language and a side foreign language in schools. So for me, the main foreign language was French, which means that, of course, I spoke Arabic. That's my native language. But at the same time, since kindergarten, there's this immersive bilingual school system. So it was French and Arabic at the same time. And then in third grade, I think, we started learning English. But the difference is we're learning 7 hours of French a week and 1 hour of English a week. Plus all the math and the sciences and all of that were taught to us in French. But then, you learn English and then exposure to a lot of media. And then in my mid-20s, something like that, I went to the US for graduate school. And living in California for a bit, I guess, got me accustomed to that North American accent, that thing. And maybe my tongue took to that. It's hard to think about that rationale because I've been living in Ireland now, in Dublin, for 5 years. Mm-hmm. And nothing took. I feel that there's nothing from the Irish accent that passed to me, aside maybe my R changed a little bit sometimes. So it's like instead of saying March, you say March, that kind of thing. But it's very minor, so I don't know what the hell's going on with that accent.
One of the things that you do when you speak English is you really are living proof that somebody coming to the language and not having it at home can really get into the language and get in deep. I mean, you talk about all sorts of things that are related to language, the etymologies, and you go through all of these stories. And how has this been for you on a sort of a personal level, moving over to a new country like the US? How do you feel that this has kind of influenced your journey in life?
I cannot deny that having, let's say, a good level of English, at least from a professional perspective, because I have my, corporate job, mm-hmm. It does lend an air of authority in that what you're talking about, especially since part of what I do is on U.S. tax laws. But other than that, it also gives you an easier way to be accepted among the people who are native speakers. That's for multiple reasons, one of which is people in Anglophone countries are used to non-native English speakers a lot more than other countries are. And so there is a higher level of acceptance in terms of, it's kind of like, oh, no, your English is good,
Mm-hmm.
that kind of thing. Whereas if you're in, let's say, Lebanon, and you try to speak in Arabic and it's broken Arabic, people will switch on you like that. So the level of when you learn English, it's easier to make mistakes. It's easier to learn. There isn't that sense of fear that may come with learning a foreign language and practicing with native speakers. At least that's my view on it.
One of the things that does come up quite often, especially for English speakers, is because English is such a massively studied language and very popular language, people want to practice it wherever you go. And so hearing you say that, of course, English speakers in the United States are not necessarily going to say, do you know what, Fadi? Let's just speak in Arabic. Or let's just speak in French.
Yes.
So it makes sense. And like you say, having this kind of accent that sounds like it's authentic to or a lot of people, or it could be from anywhere, but it sounds more like what people are accustomed to from other people who speak the language as a first language or as a home language or as a language that they've done their education through. It's interesting you say that even with English, actually, that's been a help to have kind of an authority.
In big cities, because I've been around almost every state in the US through my travels, in California, where I used to live, or in New York, people would assume that you're part of the city if you speak the way I do, without necessarily saying that you're a native speaker, but you're native-ish right away, right? But if you go into the middle of the country, they always knew that my accent is not a native accent because they are more attuned to the sounds, I believe, for lack of having folks whose native language is not English.
Yeah, that makes sense to me completely. Your ear is, I guess, more open in a bigger city where you have more people coming from lots of places, and therefore you're kind of more forgiving with slight sound changes or variations. Was there anything particular you did? I mean, we talked about pronunciation with Annelie on this on this podcast this time, and we were talking about, ways to improve your pronunciation. Is that something you actually tackled as an element of your assimilation into society?
Not really. I would say, like, at least not consciously that I can remember, right? But through trying to learn other languages, I have. So, for example, there was a period where I was dabbling with German, let's say, right? And it took a lot of conscious listening in terms of kind of like, well, the letters, the way I sound them, having, the background or either Arabic, French, or English, they don't sound like that in German. And I'm not talking about the obvious one. It's kind of like the soft CH, the sh, right? These are new sounds. But even like the L, the way the Germans pronounce the L, is different than how it is in French and English. So there was this conscious way of doing it. But in English, I don't know. Maybe it's just when you're immersed in a place, it just comes easier, maybe. It's hard to pinpoint it for me for English.
I mean, that's really good advice, though. I mean, to think about focusing on the things that you notice are more challenging or are different to the language or languages you already speak. It's kind of a nice way to focus your attention on that, to work on those particular things and not just sort of focus on pronunciation as a whole. I guess the feedback you get in your own ear, I suppose, will help with that, right?
There's also a different element to me other than the pronunciation of each individual letter, in that I notice it's kind of like if you imagine the mouth as a music box. Mm-hmm. I always think it's like, where does the sound reverberate? I don't know if that's the right word of it, right? So, for example, for French, when native French speakers, when they're talking, it feels like a lot of the sound is, the center of it is the back of the mouth up. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure if I'm explaining it right because that's maybe pseudoscience, but trying to imagine where the sound is coming from. When I lived in the US, I didn't have the opportunity to speak Arabic that much. But then when I'd go home for a visit to Lebanon and I'd just be speaking Arabic and no English, I'd come back to the US and then I noticed for the first week or so, my jaw muscles hurt because I have to articulate in English in a way where in the Lebanese dialect, I don't have to, because the sound comes a lot from the front of the mouth as opposed to, where you have to, move your jaw muscles.
So when we're talking about music and sort of how you use it, because I know you like music, you post a lot about music stuff on your stories on Instagram, for example, and there are a lot of reasons for doing that. But one of the things that you alluded to about pronunciation was this kind of melody, not just the individual words or sounds, but also the melody. And that kind of is what came across to me. Is that fair to say that there's correlation between how a language is not just put together by its component parts, but also how it then forms this melodic rhythm, this song?
I know it sounds trite to say it or cliche, but it does feel like the most universal language. It's that part about music that is more attractive to me than anything else, is that, you could feel it across the cultures.
And because you do have this porosity, and this is why I kind of thought about that question, you do have this porosity of English as well. It's not just the individual sounds that you make, but the porosity of your speech. Are you a singer? Do you enjoy actually singing as well?
Oh, hell no.
See, because you have a very melodic voice and you have a nice
a
nice tone to your voice.
Thank you. I'm tone deaf.
You're tone deaf. That's a very interesting thing actually to hear you say, because people often say, do I need to have a good ability in music to be able to represent the sounds well?
Here's the thing. What I'm saying tone deaf is just I do not have the ability to carry a tune. When people sing in the shower and they think they're great singers?
Oh, yeah.
So those were one of the few occasions where I said, it's like, okay, I'm going to record myself. And then you listen, it's like, oh my God, what was that? Like you did not hit a single note.
Oh dear. Well, I mean, in spite of that, you still sound fantastic when you speak.
Thank you. Thank you.
That's all we care about on this podcast. We're not worried about how well you sing as an individual.
Thank you.
We won't make you sing. But the whole idea with pronunciation, and I mean, this is one thing that comes up again and again and again on social media when people talk about Irish. Now, one of my personal pet peeves is the mockery of another language's spelling of their own language, particularly when it comes to Irish names. I mean, this is just nonsense. But you yourself have also, like our guest Benny Lewis, who's the Irish polyglot, he was talking to us about speaking from day one, and I know you've tackled some Irish. How has that been?
Irish to me was a complete shock. It wasn't because of learning the language as much as I live in Ireland. This is a language that is technically an official language of the country, yet not a lot of people speak it. But at the same time, a lot of things come in, two languages. So it's like, this is interesting. I want to learn. And then I'm doing the first few lessons, on Duolingo. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, oh my God, this is Arabic. And then you go to the Celtic languages and they're verb, subject, object. And I was like, this is weird. Like, why is it like that? But then you go in and you see a lot more similarities in terms of the sentence structure, how it is. It's to me, it's like Arabic. Mm-hmm. The way the pronouns are affixed to the prepositions, the way there is no indefinite article, but there is a definite, those kind of things. So as a native Arabic speaker, that was my initial point. And then going into a bit of research on Irish and all that, and seeing that there is, let's say, a contested, but there is this sub-school among linguists, where the Celtic languages, they do not call them Indo-European, but rather Semitic, like as a sub-branch of Semitic. But then as far as learning the language, there is a bit of difficulty to it if you live in Ireland, in the sense that there are three distinct dialects. So you have the Connacht dialect, you have the Munster, and you have the Ulster dialect. A lot of it is similar. However, all these three dialects were boiled down by some folks who I don't know what they were doing into a common school dialect, where they teach the kids in school and the pronunciation is gone. The way the letters are supposed to be is not right, as in it's not native.
Yeah.
I'll give you an example.
Okay.
The Prime Minister in Ireland, it's a Taoiseach. You know, most folks in Dublin, they'll say Taoiseach. The ch becomes a k, right?
Yeah.
If you're a foreign language speaker and learning, I guess it's totally fine.
Yeah.
But the way it's being taught to Irish folks, it's kind of like it's removing a lot of these sounds. It's removing the pharyngealized sounds. By that I mean the T in Taoiseach. It's not Taoiseach, it's Taoiseach. It comes from like the Arabic ta. So that part to me caused a bit of confusion, because when I would try and speak words, because learning them from native speakers, the Dublin folks was kind of like, what are you saying? They wouldn't understand me. It's kind of like, it's getting me all confused. This is not very conducive to learning the language unless, and this is the goal here, you move into the Gaeltacht, which is the areas in Ireland where Irish is spoken, on a daily basis, where you could actually learn the language better.
Have you been able to tackle that, or has it been something that stopped you in your journey with Irish?
I have to say it stopped me a little bit in that now I'm trying to learn, but I have no avenues to speak it in here. Not for lack of opportunities, I have to say. There are quite a few Irish language clubs in Ireland where you go and speak the language with folks.
Yeah.
But to say that, let's say I'm at work and I could speak Irish with somebody here, there's not that bit of opportunity there, because it's hard to talk about Irish without tackling the societal aspect of it too. In that for some folks, they have learned it in school because they have to, but they don't speak it because there's a bit of fear that they don't speak it right or something like that. There are many layers to the difficulties about practicing Irish in Ireland.
There's a lot going on in terms of identity, in terms of ability to practice in the wild, like you say. Like most languages that we learn at school, people are used to being able to go to a country and you just speak. And like you describe in Ireland, really you need to go to very specific areas to be able to do that, and not just head to any general big city and go into any random shop or cafe and speak. Makes a big difference. One thing that you did when you were discussing Irish was you made the comparison between Arabic and the sounds with Arabic and Irish. But also, as an Arabic speaker and the script and how we write things differently, even with the same script, it can be quite complicated, as I mentioned, with Irish and English, different spelling conventions. With scripts, because it is something you have discussed before, the sort of how scripts have changed. What's been your experience with writing and reading in different languages and different scripts?
Even before going to different scripts as far as non-Arabic, non-Latin, right? I have to mention Arabic a little bit. Of course, I learned Arabic since I was a kid. Mm-hmm. But as some people do, maybe not everybody does, in that Arabic has this huge division between the spoken language and the written language, the diglossia. The spoken language cannot be written, as in it cannot be written easily because there are no standards for it, which is, in the 90s, there was kind of like a makeshift Latin alphabet with substitutes, if you've ever seen it, where you write the spoken language in the Latin alphabet, and for some of the missing letters, you use numbers. The 2 for the glottal stop, the 3 for the ain, the 7 for the ha, stuff like that. When I'm speaking, my native language is the Lebanese dialect. Mm-hmm. But when I'm writing, because it's completely different, I found myself at odd times having a different native language for writing than for speaking. Right now, my native writing language is English. It was once French.
Okay.
Why? Because the written register for Arabic, al-Fusha, is not the same. Of course, I know it. I know it very much. but the flow, because it's different grammar, it's different vocabulary, it's hard for it, you know? But as far as, alphabets and scripts, for the longest time I was restricted to, Arabic and Latin alphabets, right? But then I learned a bit of Hebrew and Syriac, Aramaic, as far as the writing. And these are so incredibly similar to Arabic. When I say similar, as in there is quite a bit of equivalency between them. But I haven't had the opportunity to learn like an Abugida, like an Amharic, because we're not talking about letters. We're talking about syllables.
We had a conversation with Judith Meyer. She has these script hacking books, and she starts with really common words. So one of the things that she'll do is she'll take words that you already know, so that the cognitive load is not on worrying about the grammar or the vocabulary or whatever else. It's actually just worrying about how the sounds are represented by this new script. Have you had that experience of looking at similar words, you notice that they pop out the page a lot more quickly once you know how the sounds are?
Yes, absolutely. That has come up a lot in Hebrew and Syriac to me. I don't know if it's kind of like how we learned as children in terms of it's kind of like a game of association. It's just kind of like you learn the sound, and then when you see it, it's almost as if the letters, let's say, are all black, but there's a tinge of blue to them. It's like, oh, this one is familiar. And the process of going from almost just a few characters and sounds that you recognize to ones where you're recognizing most of them, there is a deep sense of satisfaction to that I don't know how to describe.
Yeah, I suppose because it's going to go so quickly, isn't it? It's almost like we talk in English about sight words and words that you just see and you just know what it means. It represents things just because of the form it takes, right? There is kind of a nice feeling to that when you...
Absolutely.
When it comes to reading in any of these languages as well, I mean, Ollie Richards talks about different readers and reading languages and doing intensive and extensive reading. Is this something that you do as well? Do you read in the languages that you speak or that you're studying? Is it something that's a focus for you?
It very much is. It is the main method of learning for me. I've started noticing it recently, is that even though it's a great tool of learning, but it has its drawbacks to me. In that now, let's say, I can read Spanish. I can understand 85%, let's say 80 to 85% of what I'm reading. Maybe a little bit less so now in German. That being said, it has created this wall in that I understand what I'm reading. I understand less so what I'm hearing, but let's translate that from passive to active, as in, let me speak it. And I'm finding it's kind of like, oh, what's going on? I never had this before, but now I'm finding, because I have, let's say, accumulated all these words and sentences and all that in my mind, having read them, but having never practiced them, it's creating a larger rift in comparison to spoken language versus understood languages by reading it. Again, a deep satisfaction to, this is a foreign language to me, and now I'm understanding. This is a new world that's opening up. So it's, a childlike wonder, let's say, to it.
Love, travel, study, work, friendship, whatever your reason for wanting to learn a new language, Teach Yourself provides the tools you need. Choose from over 70 languages and teach yourself today. Go to teachyourself.com, trusted by language learners for over 85 years. You mentioned before about identity and, having a language that you feel is your first language in a spoken language, like, Lebanese Arabic as a variety of Arabic. And then having Fusha, which you would write in. And then now English feels like it superseded that as a more natural outlet for writing.
Yes.
Which makes sense if you're working through English and you've done all the study in English too. I was speaking to Joe Franco, and she was born in Brazil. She then moved to the US when she was really small. Her mum spoke in Brazilian Portuguese, and she went through these phases of how she felt about her identity and how her identity shift with language learning. And to be honest, it's one of the questions I've always wanted to ask you. How's that been for you? How do you feel with your identity as you've gone through these changes and shifts in almost shifts in power within your head of your language ability and your language usage?
Yeah, thank you. That's a very, I'd say, deep question that I always keep thinking about. I have to say that there's a lot of self-criticism when it comes to that for me, because even when I do, when I do the videos on my channels, they're all in Arabic, and I often get there's a bit of worry about me doing these videos in Arabic and not coming across as native enough, because all this process of having, speaking in a certain language for an extended period of time, it affects your identity. On a positive level, you are gaining worlds of additional people that you are able to communicate with. The con, at least for me, it feels like what it is. It feels like, because with every language, there is this baggage of culture. They're interrelated, right? You're gaining a lot, but as your sense of self, it feels like you become a less distinct identity, less distinct cultural identity. It's kind of like right now, part of my Lebanese-ness is lost. I do not want to come across as one of those people, who have abandoned their culture because of the way they speak. Mm-hmm. So I always have to measure out to not say words that might come across as too Western. At the same time, it's the other way around too, where mm-hmm. I have to measure out my words in English. It's not always conscious.
I was talking recently about personality and language, and I'm a firm believer that your personality doesn't change in a language, but the facets of your personality can be perceived differently by different people, and some can be seen in one culture and not in another because of cultural norms or societal norms, and also how you are able to use the language as well. So the perception that you might get for using certain words back in Lebanon now would be different to how it may have been years ago. Does that mean that you're necessarily a very different person? You may have matured, but personality-wise, are you really a different person when you're speaking? Where do you sit with that kind of thought?
I don't want to say I sit in the middle, but there's part of it that I totally agree with you, where initially I thought at least there is a perception by some that your personality changes, right? But there is one aspect that I did notice that changed. Maybe it's not a personality, but it's mode of communication as far as rhetoric. Rhetoric, not in the political sense, but in the original sense of the meaning. I'm not sure if you've heard of, forgot his first name, but Kaplan and contrastive rhetoric, which is how do I relay a message to you to convince you of something, let's say. But the idea is that he said that if we want to visualize the way English's rhetoric is a straight point. Think of it's kind of like, we need to do this because this. In Semitic languages, the way he said it, and I totally believe it, there is no such thing. How do I relay a point? It relies a lot on repetition. It relies a lot on changing my words mm-hmm. for the audience, using specific words that audience would understand, using a lot of different imagery that would fit. So it looks like bam, bam, bam. It's kind of like starting from far and inching towards it, right? When you learn different languages and eventually submerge yourself in, let's say, the societal aspect and of all of these languages, there is a part of you that might change with time. So, for example, when I am speaking in Arabic now, I might come across as too direct because of the way that English speakers speak. At the same time, it's kind of like for someone who learns Arabic and then goes back, they might come across as elusive or indecisive. I'm saying come across because This is not a personality thing. This is kind of like it's baked into the language in a way.
Yeah, I completely see your point. Definitely when I speak in English, I notice that I'm more direct than a lot of people that I grew up around in my communication style. And that's because I lived in Germany and I worked in the Netherlands as well. And the style of communication is very straightforward. You do pick up on these things. And I agree with you, this isn't necessarily personality. It's a growth thing. And I then don't change that. This is also probably one of the problematic issues as well that you alluded to with Arabic now. Because this has impacted the communication style that you have, it's been a learning process.
Yes.
Your personality is then perceived through a different lens again.
Yes.
When you go back to the other language.
Yes.
So it's not that you've changed personalities, it's just that you're perceived differently. I always try to kind of convey this because I notice it myself. I'm funnier sometimes in one language than another, and sometimes I don't know how funny I am. I'm not saying that I'm particularly funny. I'm not going to make a career in stand-up comedy. But when I say things, even in languages that I've spoken for a long time, because I still didn't grow up in that culture, I will say things I think they're kind of mildly amusing. Sometimes they'll hit really, really higher than my mildly amusing. Sometimes they'll fall really flat. But my intention's still the same. It's just the way it hits is always going to be a bit different. One of the things that, with you having this richness of experience, linguistically, culturally, is that it really adds to what you put out there publicly. You talk about stories and languages and etymologies. What do you get yourself from all of this? I mean, this sort of, how does it make you feel when you're going swimming between all these different rivers?
The feeling I get that when you're going through a word and you discover that we took it from another language, which they took it from another language for this reason or the other, it feels like with every one of these, there is a story and there's a treasure. And it just makes me so happy. Like I can't describe it. The idea of doing these videos, it's a research that I'm doing and it feels like so awesome. It's like, oh, I got to share it. There's this sense of adventure in a way, in the nerdiest way possible. I'm not saying that in a bad connotation, but adventure and discovery and just relaying what you're discovering.
Have there been any examples of these stories that you've shared that you've got a particularly big response from on your channel?
Quite a few of them, but if I'm trying to think of one, a big one was talking about parsley. To me, that was insane. So parsley in Arabic is ba'dunis, right? And then realizing, it's kind of like, where did we get that from? It's kind of like we got that from Ottomans who got them, from Greek. But that's because the parsley, the original name in ancient Greek was Petroselinon Makedonisi. So Petro, rock, Selinon means celery, and Makedonisi means Macedonia. And then Alexander the Great, which in Arabic is Iskandar al-Maqduni. So to find out that in how it got back to us, and even it was reborrowed into some modern Greek dialects, that Alexander and parsley in these languages are related that way. Another one where I was thinking once about the Neanderthals, the tal in Neanderthal and dollar are also linked because it comes from that. They're subjects that are not really linked, but if you go back to them, you'll find that they're, actually linked together.
There are so many that you've shared and that I've just really enjoyed. I think particularly because I live in a part of the world most of the year where, we have this crossover from the Ottoman times where a lot of words were taken from Arabic and from Persian and entered into the Balkan languages. And even though they are Indo-European and the obviously Turkic and Semitic languages are not, the crossover is really, really interesting. And I also enjoy what you say, seeing these similarities and the stories that bring us together, especially in times where we see lots of division. focusing on what makes us the same and what we have in common is just such a nice thing, I think. For you personally, have there been any examples that you've come across that have just made you feel, even if they haven't got the response maybe of the two that you mentioned now, are there any stories or any things that you've noticed that you think, well, do you know what, actually that makes me feel really good and it's really interesting, it's just got you?
It's a very simple one. Talking about oranges, the fruit, in that a lot of these words related to food, going back to the languages and imagining the the trade route from that word, it's opening a new world through different avenues. I'm not reading a history book. I'm just seeing how this word came to us. Yeah. So seeing that naranj came, from India to Persian to Arabic, then went to Italy, and then there's where the rebracketing happened. It's kind of like the N was lost and how it traveled. But then, even though it was an Arabic word, it's not originally, but it passed through Arabic, but then that's not the word we have, because the sweet orange came from China to Portugal, and we took it from Portugal, and our word for Portugal is the same as orange almost. Portugal and Portugal. It's kind of like, you can pretty much imagine, like, let's say a world map and all these lines that are starting to connect. Mm-hmm. So, and what other than food, can fill these lines? It's just nice.
Yeah, I like it. This rebracketing that you talk about. We don't imagine that it was ever anything except for an orange, but of course It was a Norrange.
Norrange.
Which sounds funny when you say it now. And there are many more examples in English like this that are just super funny, like an apron, an apron.
Yeah. Even in Arabic, by the way.
Yeah. Have you got any good examples you can share?
Oh, yeah, I can think of two now, because, the definite article in Arabic is al, right? So you can see that in a lot of Spanish words. But, for example, we were talking about Alexander the Great, right? So Alexander, notice how it starts with al. There was a rebracketing and a metathesis between the S and the K. So Al-Iskandar, it became Iskandar, and now it's a common first name, at least in Lebanon, Skandar, which comes from Alexander, because they thought the L was the definite article. And in a more, let's say, not so nice example, the Alzheimer disease, right? In Egypt is known as Zaheimer, because the Al was perceived as being the definite article. So there was a rebracketing there. It's called Zaheimer.
Yeah. It's incredible, isn't it? How you kind of the almost this societal consciousness will pick apart a word and change it to its own whims, really. But it also shows the beauty of this natural evolution of language.
Yeah. One example that I can think of now too, where one word had two rebраcketings. I don't know if it's the unicorn. Unicorn. It went to French as une licorne, right? But then it's like, let's write with the definite articles, it would be L apostrophe, so licorne. Then it's like, no, let's merge them back together. So now it's une licorne. So it went through these two stages.
I always wondered why it was licorne in French. It was always very odd to me, because the corn is like, the corn is the kind of the horn, right, that you talk about. But it is a very odd thing, the licorne in French.
It is.
Now, Fadi, before we finish up, I just want to say, we talk about language learning and why it's important, and people often have a very fixed idea as to what the benefits are to language learning. And I think what I hope has come across during this is that actually there's an enrichment of your daily experience, your life. And if you were to leave the listeners today with a message of encouragement, motivation, of how this has affected you and why they should learn languages and be interested in thinking about language, what would you say?
To me, what I found, and through the videos, is that another aspect is that, especially in our region, there is a bit of, let's say, tinges of unnecessary over-nationalism, right? And it goes to the languages, too. It's kind of like, my language was the first. My language is pure. And for people who have that, when you learn language, it's kind of like you start noticing that all those purists, once you learn the language, it feels like this is wrong and unnecessary. It makes you a more open person to interpretations and borrowings from different cultures. And it makes you understand that we are not in a vacuum. A language is not in a vacuum.
Yeah.
It's this whole learning about new cultures in the modern times that's amazing. Yes, but that also happened in previous times, and we have the marks of it in each of our own languages. These words came because we had interactions with other cultures, and these marks should be taken with pride, I think, in terms of like, this is the exchange we had.
Absolutely. I mean, we take a lot of time and we spend a lot of our energy in teaching children, the next generations, the importance of sharing.
Yes.
And I think this is what this does for the adults out there.
Yes.
It makes you realize that you also can share language with your neighbors and with people even far away. And it's all good. It enhances all of our lives, not just the fact of gatekeeping or keeping everything to ourselves.
Beautifully said. Thank you, Richard.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much for your time. If people want to find you, where's the best place to go?
Either Instagram or TikTok. Mm-hmm. I have the same username, Cedrusk, Cedrusk.
And I absolutely wholeheartedly recommend a visit to his channels and to subscribe, because they are real diamonds that appear before your eyes on social media when you're doom scrolling at 3 o'clock in the morning. And any time of day, to be honest. I absolutely love and value the work that you do online to enhance our experience of language in the world, and seeing things through your eyes has been really, really a great pleasure for me. So thank you for joining me today, for agreeing to do this interview, and shukran elf mara habibi.
Shukran. Thank you so much for having me. Shukran lak.
A massive thank you to Fadi BouKaram for joining me on the Language Podcast. And that's a wrap for Season 2. Have we inspired you to kickstart your language learning journey? Is there anything else you'd like us to cover in the future? Get in touch. I'd love to hear from you. Thanks for listening. Bye bye for now.